I want to welcome everybody as you get started coming in. We're going to kick off in a couple of minutes once we let the rest of the group fill in, but welcome. All right, now we're going to kick off. So I want to welcome everyone for coming today to one of our Tiger Alumni Week webinars, doing a comprehensive college search, insider tips and recommendations. My name is Megan Cheever, and I'm the Senior Director of Regional and Volunteer Programs at RIT's Office of Alumni Relations. Before I introduce our speakers, I have a few housekeeping items that I want to discuss. All attendees have joined in mute mode. However, you can still ask questions by entering them in the question and answer box at any time throughout our discussion. We will make every effort to address all of the comments and questions throughout the course of this event. This program is also being recorded. It will be made available in the upcoming weeks on our website. A communication with how to access this recording and all of our other programs from Tiger Alumni Week will be sent out and posted on our website. If you have any technical issues during the course of this event, please feel free to type those in the chat box as well, and we'll do our best to get you the appropriate answers. Now I want to thank our sponsors. Our premier sponsor, Sharp Notions, as well as our Tiger sponsor, Rochester Regional Health, for helping make this week's program possible. We also want to thank our Access Services team for helping us make this webinar accessible for all of our alumni. Real-time captioning is available within the webinar, and our interpreters will be spotlighted during this presentation. As we all know, the pandemic has had a major impact on everyone, including our students. And we want to thank all of our alumni and friends for the support that you've given to those students during these uncertain times. If you didn't already know, today is Roar Day. So thank you to everyone who has also made a gift to RIT. And if you haven't, there's still time. You can make a gift right now by visiting rit.edu/roar, and your gift will be counted towards our Roar Day total to help us achieve the 1.5 million goal. You'll see that link in the chat box. And now I would like to kick off our main event by introducing Tanya Dolezal, Senior Assistant Director in the Office of Undergraduate Admissions and Enrollment Management at RIT, who will be our moderator for this afternoon. Tanya?
Thanks, Megan. And now on to our session. I'm pleased to welcome Ian Mortimer, who will discuss some insider tips and recommendations on navigating the college search. Ian is Vice President for Enrollment Management at RIT. Prior to his tenure at RIT, he served as Vice President for Enrollment and Student Experience at Nazareth College in Rochester and Vice President for Enrollment Management at Champlain College in Burlington, Vermont. Ian, thank you for joining us. The audience is all yours.
Great, thanks, Tanya, and thanks everyone for your time today. Before I kind of kick things off, let me frame what I'm hoping to accomplish with our time together. And the first is to share with you, some of the ways that the college search process has happened traditionally. And so, as Tanya mentioned, I've been doing this work for quite a while. But actually what has given me the most credibility is that I just put my first child in college last fall, actually this fall. He's a first-year student at a school out in Maine. And so what that experience had taught me is that, I thought I knew a lot about college admissions and financial aid, but going through it as a parent, you actually learn a lot about what you don't know. And so, from being on both sides of the experience, I feel like I'm more equipped to talk with you today than probably I ever have been, both as a practitioner as well as a parent. So what I'd like to do is kind of walk through with you, some of the traditional steps and thought processes that go into college search, and what I hope is some insightful ways to think about the process. And then without a doubt, based on the thoughts that Megan had shared, is that, we are in a kind of a state of change and a state of transition in higher education. And those changes have absolutely and will continue to impact how students and parents should think about the college search process post-pandemic. And so I do have quite a few slides. that hopefully give you a little bit of a juxtaposition in terms of the traditional ways that we've gone through the process, and then some new ways based on the pandemic. What I'm hoping is that after a half hour or so, the Q&A can be really active, and we can get to a point of conversation. And I would love to hear any concerns or questions or insights from anyone in the audience that we can learn from each other from. So without further ado, I'm going to jump right into things, and again, about half hour of content, and then I would love to hear things that are top of mind for you. So this slide is, although kind of a crude graphic, homemade, admittingly, I do think represents how the traditional college purchasing, selection, buying process happens for most students as they go about this discovery process. And on the lower area of the chart is just the timeline. So from the beginning of college search till the end. And then on the left axis, what you see are some different stages that most students and families go through as a part of this. And then through the middle, what you can see is typically kind of a whittling down of the framework as students go through the timeline. But I want to highlight a couple of things here. One is that for most families, the college search process is one that has a lot of facts and a lot of data associated with it. And so students will begin looking at schools based on, do they have my program? Are they located in the city that I want to be in? And what do their career statistics look like? And things that are very factual that data can inform, through research and through experience. However, the other side of it is that, buying a college, and I like using that term because it's a major investment, is also incredibly emotional. And there are things about different campuses or schools or locations that you really can't substantiate with any kind of hard facts or hard, rational decision making. But there's an emotional tie or emotional tug that happens when you walk on that campus or you learn about the values of that institution. And the way that it works for most students is that the process, the college search process, starts very factual and very rational, and then over time becomes much more emotional, and emotions end up kind of driving a lot of the final decision making. And then there's this kind of final evaluation that happens around value and affordability. And so if you think about it in three stages, the first again being this kind of factual, rational discovery process, the second being this kind of emotional, do I fit in? Do I like the students there? Am I going to be happy? Type of a thought process. And then the third stage is usually value and affordability, given that most families have some kind of a major investment decision to go through as a part of this. The one thing I will say is that the number of schools that students and families are considering at the front end of this process, historically is somewhere around 10 to 15. One of the phenomenons that COVID has created this year is that end is starting much smaller. We're looking at our own application numbers, and this is consistent with what the Common Application is sharing with us, in that most students right now are actually starting at 3 or 4 colleges or universities, just because the level of engagement is so much less than it has been in previous years. And so obviously that changes this framework a little bit. But some of the criteria that many of you may have thought about or will think about, again, are kind of these factual, rational criteria. And let me kind of explain, some of these things that oftentimes happens. The first is that college search, just like a lot of services and a lot of products, is very category driven. And what I mean by that is that most students will shop and evaluate in research schools based on categorical structures. So as an example, RIT usually falls into line within 2 large structures within higher education. The first is that students that are looking to pursue a STEM-based education usually associate RIT with that category, And they'll associate schools like RPI, WPI, Stevens Institute of Technology, just to name a few. And usually if a student is applying to RIT and they're from the Northeast, they're going to apply to RPI as well. If they're applying to RIT and they're from the major New York metro area, they're probably applying to Stevens Institute of Technology. And so these categorical frameworks absolutely exist. The other category that we compete in is the co-op category. And so the structure of those institutions are typically RIT, Northeastern, and Drexel University in Philadelphia. And so for students and families that really want a career-based education, they'll typically apply to us and the other two institutions just because we're the three that do it the best in the Northeast. And then also, we also compete in the large public space as well, where if a student is applying to RIT and they're from New York, they're probably applying to Binghamton, and if they're from Massachusetts, they're probably applying to UMass. And so again, this categorical framework is absolutely something that is tangible, and you should be aware of it because it can be trapping. And so I'll use my own son as an example. He was interested in kind of a smaller private arts environment, and immediately his category was shaped based on what he perceived the quality based on selectivity. And so we looked at schools that were mostly in the NESCAC and the Patriot League. And I kept pushing him to challenge his assumptions on what a quality, liberal arts education would look like or how it should be described. But I couldn't get him or anyone else to really move beyond these artificial, frameworks that again are structural, just based on the way that higher education is structured. The other rational criteria, which is very, very important, particularly at a place like RIT, is that a lot of students will begin their process shopping on major. And so there's this perception that I want to study this or I want to be this. And there's a little bit of a trap to this as well, in that, even looking at our own data, most of our students will move around the college from major to major or even college to college within their time at RIT. We are much more major focused than other institutions, but even at a place like us, a lot of students are moving around from major to major. And given that reality, it challenges this assumption that I need to pick a college based on they have my major, knowing that a lot of change and a lot of movement happens along that journey. So as you're coaching and you're working with your son or daughter, and they say, well, I want to study this at this school, in the back of your mind, think about, well, if this major isn't what they like, do they have some really, really great safety nets or second choices or third choices that can be helpful so that we don't run into some dissatisfaction. The one thing I will say also is that some institutions are just stronger in different programs than others. And so, school X may have a better profile and, be more selective, but studying that major at that school, may not be as good as studying that major at a place that's less selective. And so as you're thinking about the different criteria, and major seems to be important, please push and understand if that is one of their stronger programs. One of the great tragedies of higher education is that we associate selectivity with quality. And, again, I think this is, one of the few inputs that we have in terms of perceived quality. I would look at selectivity with a grain of salt, knowing that anything that is statistically measured can also be statistically influenced. And so if you hear along the conversation with your son or daughter that, well, I'm really not interested in that school because their admit rate is X or they're not selective enough, really challenge that assumption, because oftentimes, just by the sheer size of an institution, they can't be as selective, but they may be a world-class place, particularly for what they're interested in. And then some other bullets along the way. The one bullet I want to put some more spotlight on is the second to last, and that is career success. And this is really important if there's one thing that I say that I hope resonates. In that since the recession of 2008, that pushed a lot of colleges and universities to claim to be excellent in career preparation. And so when you look at different colleges and you look at their statistics, what you'll see and what you'll hear is that everybody has a placement rate, above 95, 96, 97%. And when you really take a look at the grounding from which those statistics are shared, they're oftentimes ill-informed, or they are based on a sample size that is very, very low. One of the things at RIT that I love is that when we claim to have done well from career and co-op and these important statistics, they're coming from a place of statistical significance and represent the majority of our population. So when we say that 97% of our students are employed in their field in 6 months, it's not based on a sample of 10% of the overall pool. It's based on a sample of more than 80%. And so again, be a little bit buyer beware of these statistics that get shared. Oftentimes they're not grounded in much value, or at least in much evidence of real scientific fact. The flip side, emotional, this is where we fall in love. This is where you walk around a campus and you're like, oh my gosh, I cannot see myself anywhere else. I look around and the sun is shining and I just love, love, love this place. And there's a little bit of trap here. And I want to put this into position with the rational side. The best college search processes, at least from my perspective, are ones that balance well this idea of the factual, rational inputs along with the emotional side. And they really should be held in equal balance. For students that make a college decision too much on the rational side, they run the risk of not being happy because they haven't thought enough about, is this a place that can just make me happy as a human? And on the flip side, I've seen many students make the decision to attend X because they fall in love, but they really haven't taken the time to think about the academic piece to it, the rigor piece, the curriculum, again, the things that are more factual. And so one of the things I would recommend is that before you visit a school, literally on a piece of paper, put facts and put emotions. And at the end of the trip, list out both of those pieces separately. And hopefully you get a more objective and a more kind of accurate lens of how that visit went or how that evaluation went, rather than running the risk of being too factual or too emotional. Next, I have the slides. And then the last piece is affordability and value. And this obviously is of huge paramount, particularly in the context of coming out of 08 and coming out of COVID. And the thing that I would offer is that there will be no better time in the history of higher education as a consumer than the time that we're going to be coming up upon over the next 5 years in higher education. And the reason being is that there are going to be a lot of schools, really good schools, that are going to find themselves in some pretty difficult supply and demand situations. And what I would offer is that if there's a school that you're really, really feeling like this could be a great target for us, but the sticker price is one that causes you a little shock, I would be all in pursuing as many options as you can because of the competitive context that we're going to be coming into post-COVID. If you even think about Rochester as an example, international enrollments have been a very, very important input into the sustainability of many institutions. And for a variety of reasons, international enrollments are just going to become a lot more difficult. And so what that will mean is that institutions and colleges and universities will be leaning more on their domestic student supply to make them successful. And where there's competition, there's a lowering of costs, and that's exactly what will be happening over the next 5 or 6 years. So my suggestion is that don't overextend, do not take too much debt, but allow the competitive framework to happen, and then use your resources wise to find the best rational and emotional match. So that leads us to some of the challenges with this year. And so the next 5 or 6 slides, what I would like to offer are some things that are going to change based on the COVID environment within higher education. And let me just walk through these, and then again, we can get into some Q&A. So one of the first big changes is that most schools, as a result of the difficulty of being able to take an SAT or an ACT, have gone test optional. And RIT is one of these institutions. And so what that means is that gives us less data to make decisions with. And so many schools have been test optional for a lot longer than RIT has. And they've built ways and mechanisms to identify talent and to identify capacity. But there's a lot of schools like us, this is a whole new thing for. And so one of the things that we will be working through is finding our way in making decisions on pretty technical areas without an SAT math score and without a verbal score. And we'll be leaning much more heavily on things like recommendations and interviews and essays, with the reality in that high school transcripts weren't always as helpful before the pandemic. After the pandemic, they'll probably be less helpful because of fluctuations in grading policies. A lot of high schools have gone past fail. I have a high schooler in my house right now, and he's already talking about some of the relaxation of grading that seems to be happening within his high school environment. And it's not to point fingers, but it's just going to be much more difficult. And so my piece of advice would be is to really go out there and build relationships and rapport with the schools that your son or daughter is interested in attending. Relationships this year will matter more than they ever have before, just based on less information coming in through the application pipeline. I feel really confident that we as an admissions office, led by Marion Nicoletti and supported by our other team, have been really thoughtful on how we navigate in this new dynamic. And I know we have some statistical mechanisms in place, but for many schools, this is going to be a lot more difficult. The other thing, a couple of other things that may be helpful is that, and I'll go right to the third bullet. There will be a time over the next 9 months that SATs and ACTs will become available. And, even if it's, it's after March 1, you have the opportunity and you're a good test taker to take the tests. I would advise it for the following reasons: is that there's going to be a lot more waitlist activity this year than even there was last year. And if all things being equal, a student is on the wait list, but they have a late test score, that is, again, favorable to the process, that could be something that that could push them above other candidates. And there's no harm in taking an SAT or an ACT. You get the choice in terms of whether those scores are submitted or not submitted. But as you start seeing the shakeout of SATs and ACTs becoming available, and your son or daughter has prepared, I don't think there's a too late in this conversation. I think it will be really smart for many students to take it. The other thing that I've been advising some just neighborhood families and families within our network regarding essays is that nobody's going to want to read about the victimization of coming out of COVID. And to be candid, I've read some essays and personal statements as first drafts from individuals, and the language and the theme of them has been a little bit tragic in terms of the impact of COVID on their high school journey. I think that there's a real opportunity for individuals to be inspirational and creative in their personal statements and within their essays, to help inspire and to help tell a story of why this particular student is going to rise above, or I've learned this and I'm ready to take on the world. My sense is that there's going to be a lot of essays that are going to be, they're going to take the more of the woe is me kind of track, and no one wants to read about that. I think the essays that will rise to the top are ones that are really, really inspirational. And it's just a piece of advice as you're coaching your son or daughter in terms of topics to write about. So what does it mean? How do you evaluate a school when we're in this kind of weird environment of no events? And these are just some things that, have, are complicating our life, particularly at RIT. We would have more than 3,000 open house visitors at this point now, on our campus this fall. And so, our offering in terms of campus visits is literally a tour with one family and one tour guide. We could make them a little bit bigger, but we don't feel like that is responsible. And so, we're open 7 days a week. And I think last Sunday we had 17 tours. That is very different than having an open house of 1,200 students, for a given day. And so we're just going to have a lot fewer people that have ever stepped foot on our campus. And that will create ripples in terms of how we think about our pool and our mid pool and where things will end up. And so a couple of things that I think will be helpful as you think about this. And obviously, being alums, most of you, this is right in your sweet spot. So I do believe that alumni will have a much more powerful opportunity in helping students gain access to colleges and universities this year than they ever have before. And so even if it's not RIT, and I hope it for many of you, RIT is in the consideration set, but reaching out to alums within your geography and having your son or daughter sit down with them either remotely or face-to-face in a coffee shop, giving them the opportunity to establish rapport and a relationship will absolutely help in the admissions process, particularly if the admissions office has some kind of a formal alumni program. One of the things that absolutely helped my son out is that he, through suggestion, sat down with two of the alums of the school that he eventually landed on. And they were just really, really helpful, in not only in the learning, but also they were helpful in terms of the recommendation process. I think that is a really good tactic coming out of this year. The other thing is that as admissions officers, we love to know the faces and the personalities behind the files that we're reading. And so if your son or daughter has 2 or 3 schools that maybe reaches or they may be aspirational, it is completely appropriate to reach out to the admissions officer that manages your geography and request a brief conversation or an interview or whatever is made affordable, and just allow your son or daughter to tell their story to them. I think that even that simple outreach will demonstrate an elevated level of interest. And we remember the students that reach out to us. It's just kind of human nature. And so the more that they do that, the more that I think you'll have opportunities. And then I think the headline is that no one wants to be anonymous. Without test scores and with transcripts that'll probably be half-baked, being anonymous is not going to help anyone, especially you as young people. And so please take the time and energy to introduce yourself, let them know who you are, and make that a part of it. And then the last piece of this are the financial shifts. And so this is just kind of iterative or reiterative of everything that I've shared. The one thing that I'd like to jump to is the last bullet. There will be a little bit of a reckoning coming out of COVID for some private colleges and universities. And if you're looking at a financial aid package and you're thinking to yourself, wow, this really is too good to be true, I would take a healthy dose of curiosity and try and understand why the generous financial aid package. One of the things that will happen as a result of this is that there'll be some desperation that comes out of colleges and universities to just hang on for 1 more year or 3 more years or 5 more years. No one wants to be an alum of a school that doesn't exist anymore. And so if you're finding that the aid package is a little bit off whack compared to other ones, or the merit scholarship, maybe a little bit misaligned with what you know to be the academic truth. I would be, you want to be supportive and congratulatory. I do think it's healthy to be a little skeptical as well, just to protect your long-term investment. The other thing that the first bullet that I'd like to highlight is that one of the things we do not do well in higher education, and I think it's admissions and financial aid, that we need to do a lot more of, is helping families understand the total investment of a particular college or university. We're so uber focused on getting access or getting in for that 1 year, or understanding, kind of the short-term financial commitment, that oftentimes the long-term financial commitment is understated. And what I would offer is that to build a spreadsheet with the current cost for the year that your son or daughter is entering in, and then build it out, 3 or 4 years, and then build in some assumptions. So, average year-over-year increase about 3%. If you're going to take on some debt, put in those inputs, and debt is okay as long as you graduate, and put those in, and then look at the contract between you and this institution from a holistic level. I think what you'll find is that if you decide to attend that school, you'll just feel better about going into it eyes wide open. This is what the financial reality will be over the next 4 or 5 years. And then the other piece to it is that you kind of take the emotion out of the short-term scholarship announcement, which is something, to be candid, intentionally we try and do, is really, really create a lot of positive emotion around scholarships. And they are important, and they're really, really significant. But again, as a family, take a look, the long view, and just make sure everything is cool, looking out 4 or 5 years. And then this is my last slide. As I've already mentioned, we're in this kind of weird, state where, the emotional piece, has some new inputs in terms of, is the school even open? Which is, that some schools that we compete with are all online. And so understanding what does that mean in the context of fall 2021. And then also, really be rational and thoughtful in terms of truly understanding, what the program pieces are and the things that are really important on a rational side. I think this is the year to double down on those things. The thing that I would also offer is that being early in everything you do in this particular cycle will prove itself to be very, very valuable. If your applications are in, if your financial aid forms are in, if you've done a little bit more research earlier rather than later, you will have a lot more kind of easy breathing thought process type of criteria selecting mannerisms, rather than being laid and up against it. You just want to avoid that at all costs. And I'm just trying to think. I think the other piece to it is that as a result of COVID, there is going to be a shakeup, at least from our perspective, of what the job market and what the employment market is going to be seeking. And what I would offer is that as you're going through the evaluation process with your son or daughter, ask questions collectively of what does this major look like 5 years from now in a post-COVID world. And so to give you an example, the world of science, there's a lot of students who are studying biology and chemistry and, physics and kind of traditional life and physical sciences. I think the appropriate question, if you're interested in those, is, what does a career 5 years out from now look like with someone with a BS in biology? And what does a career in 5 years from now look like with someone with a BS in chem? And think about, does this institution truly understand the future of the workforce? And do they truly understand that we're entering into a phase where, robotics and AI are going to have a pretty heavily influence on everything we do? And it's a self-serving statement, but I do think that for colleges and universities, they're not thinking about the future. Their curriculums and their experiences oftentimes align with that. And we're in a state where the future is really important. and we're going to move pretty fast towards it. And so, thinking about that in college selection, I think is really appropriate. So I'm going to stop talking. I think it's been about a half an hour, and I would love any questions that are in the queue or anything that is top of mind. And Tanya, are you going to be able to read those or?
Yes, really fantastic information, Ian. Thank you so much.
Yep.
For our participants, if you have some questions, we'd love for you to put them in the Q&A. Ian has just a wealth of information and has been in this business for what, 60 years now, Ian? Is that fair?
65 years, yep.
So he is a great resource if you have questions. I have a couple that we'd like to start with. But first, Ian, could you speak a little bit about rankings? I know that I get asked this question. I always compare it to, like, if you're a dermatologist, I think people will probably maybe try to show you a mole. If you work in admissions, everyone asks questions, and this is one that I get a lot. So could you talk a little bit about rankings and how families should look at and think about those in their search?
Yeah, great question. I think I've come around on this a little bit for the following reasons. Is that when US News started the ranking process, it was a beauty contest. And what I mean by that is that they were very, very heavily weighted on criteria that was very public relations based, and it was very much, based on the historical lineage or reputation of the school. And they would use things that were easily manipulatable to build their rankings. And so, year over year, it was just, the prettiest, most highly endowed schools just had a natural advantage in those rankings. What they've done to their credit is that they've put metrics on performance much more embedded in their criteria. So things like graduation rates. I think graduation rate now is the number one weighted data point in rankings. And so I do think that there is some merit in not, thinking that they are truly the sort order of quality or the sort order of how you should think about them. But I actually think that they can be helpful in understanding, kind of how I should think about the school. If a school is, as well as the competitiveness, but if a school is really, really buried in the third tier and the fourth tier, you better have a pretty compelling reason of why you're going there. Just because the data would suggest that that's a place that's going to be tough to dig out of. So I do think they're worthwhile looking at it. I think they should be one of 20 inputs, but I think it's worthwhile.
Great, thank you. We do have a question that came in from one of our participants, and it relates to the SAT, which I know, Ian, you touched on in your presentation, but they're wondering how not having the SAT will impact decisions, particularly for maybe more selective colleges prior to and then after the pandemic.
Yeah, I think, right now we are anticipating that about half of our applications will have test scores. So, and I think we actually may be more on the conservative side, given, we have a lot of STEM-based majors. And so getting back to this idea of how to tell your story in a way that differentiates yourself is really, 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 really going to be important. So let me just kind of get back to this slide. I think finding creative ways to demonstrate interest is going to be important, and a couple of those ways I've talked about, but let me add one more. Faculty love it when a prospective student reaches out and says, I am really, really interested in studying something that you care deeply about, and allowing a relationship to bud between the prospective student and the faculty member via email is more than appropriate, can be a pretty powerful way for having your interests, move up into the admissions process. And it's just another example of how I think relationships and telling your unique story and, demonstrating a sincere interest in that school is going to be really important. I'm very concerned about transcripts on how they're going to appear this year. Again, because of the right decisions that many schools went through and just, relaxing grading policies. So when you think about, the class that's entering in 2021, for many of them, their last trimester or their last quarter was, diluted, based on COVID. And now, we're kind of entering into a half of a year under the same educational modality at many of those schools. It's going to be tough to understand, kind of how prepared students are going to be. And without test scores, the thing that we're going to have to rely on are grades before the pandemic, recommendations that come from counselors and other people. But most importantly, it's going to be how the student tells their story and why a school should care. And so for those who can write well and those who can, have the relationship building skills, you're going to have to, I think people have to work for it, particularly at the top tier.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about early programs, kind of early decision, early action, what families should know about that and how, taking advantage of one of those programs might impact their admission?
Yep, great question. I think, again, getting around this kind of world of more competition and less information, if your son or daughter aspires to go to Yale, just throw, word out there, Yale, and, they're kind of on the outside looking in, applying early this year will have more of an impact than maybe it did last year. And the reason being is that, and we're one of these schools, is that, we will want to have as much of our class in hand going into 2021 as possible. And so, what that means is that for students and families that know they want to go here, applying early decision will absolutely give them an advantage. There's no doubt about it. The downside of early decision is that, you're calling off the search, assuming that you're admitted. The way that we approach it, though, just so for everyone's knowledge, is that, we approach early decision that if the student is admitted and we have proven that it is an affordable option, then we expect that student or family to enroll based on the conditions of early decision. If they're admitted and after the financial aid process, it's just not in their best interest to take on that much debt, or it's going to be too much of a struggle, we will release them from early decision and allow them to pursue their other options. I actually think that's the ethical way to do it. But the headline is that ED will absolutely have more of a factor this year. For schools that are early action, these are schools that you can apply earlier to and receive your admissions notice earlier. I would say that, get your EA apps in as many of those schools as possible. And then the last thing I will say is that I think what you'll find is that the earlier you apply, the earlier you'll receive notice no matter where you apply. So even if you apply regular decision, getting the app in, getting it completed, you'll hear sooner than maybe you would have last year. No one understand the timelines, but earlier is absolutely going to be better in every scenario.
All right, thank you. We'd love to see some more questions come in. So if any of you have them, please feel free to put those into the Q&A. Ian, could you talk a little bit about timing? We maybe have some participants that have younger, early high school, 9th, 10th graders, for example. When do you think it makes sense to start conversations and sort of the planning process, for college prep?
Yeah, good question. I'm going to go back to this one, if it's okay. The early part of this is the most time consuming, and it requires the most effort of families. So, getting your list from 10 to 5 is the process where, you're spending the most time on research. You're probably visiting, those schools, and it's just, there's this kind of big funnel to kind of small select group process. For families that start late, call late, the beginning of the senior year. When you think about all the steps and activities that have to happen within 9 months, it's pretty logical that there's going to be some rush decisions or some missteps or even some missed opportunities. And I would argue that even starting halfway through the junior year is probably not enough time nowadays. One of the things that I'll speak selfishly that I think we did well with Neil is that we started just the exploration of how to think about college and how to think about this process towards the end of his sophomore year. And it wasn't like, hey, you got to start looking because you need to know what you want to do. It was more along the lines of, hey, we're going to be in Boston anyway. Let's go on, 2 or 3 tours and just get a sense of how we should think about this. And what that provided is that when we got into his junior year, we were less around discovery and more about really getting to a fine point of what we cared about. And then when we went into the senior year, we were pretty done, around November. And I think if you can think about, again, getting to this and build a timeline, we want to be able, we want to be here at this month of this year. At this month and this year, we want to be kind of done with this. I think you'll find that it'll be less anxiety, less emotion, more factual, more logical, and I think you'll land in a better spot. But just to kind of reiterate one thing, early college search should not be pressure building. It should actually be family building and conversation building and really educational more than anything else.
Great. We have just a couple more questions here. The first is if you could talk a little bit about the role that extracurricular activities play in an application. I know a lot of families wonder, what should my son or daughter be involved in? How do those activities get presented and how might those impact a decision?
Yep, great question. They're really important, again, particularly as we come out of COVID. The one thing that I would suggest is that when you're articulating those experiences and those activities, try and stay away from just saying, I did community service or just saying that, I volunteered at this organization, where admissions offices, what they want to see is evidence of learning from those things and evidence of impact. And so, community service has quickly become, what was once kind of this distinctive, thing that a lot of young people have done has become kind of a checkbox. And the high schools have reinforced this, in my opinion, at some level. And so if community service and giving back to your community is your thing, it's going to have to be distinctive compared to every student who has claimed to do community service and who has claimed to give back. And the only way you can do that is by telling stories or by explaining, at a really, really granular, using good language and good narratives of what that experience taught that person, rather than just claiming that I did it. The one thing that we're really excited about at RIT is that the performing arts is a space that we actually think is underserved, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities, at least at our place, for students that may not want to major in music or dance or musical theater, but those things are really important to who they are and have been kind of character building and they've been part of who they are throughout high school. And the performing arts area, I do think, is going to be really, really big and popular moving forward. And I think it's going to provide a lot of opportunity for students and families that are interested in that want to get in and find great schools for those particular activities. It just seems like it's kind of the thing now. And then the other thing I would offer is that doing things that are distinctive is really a great idea. So, if there's a story that can be told that someone can tell that no one else can, or at least not as well, find those activities that maybe are outside the high school or, outside of things that are traditionally done, or at least tell them differently. And I think that, ears will perk up as they observe them.
Okay, super. And our last question actually relates to financial aid. Could you talk a little bit, I think financial aid in the office and the process is a little bit of a mystery to families, but I actually think it's such a great resource for families. Can you talk a bit about the process of how the application for admission moves to financial aid and what that looks like and what sort of resources families have as it relates to financial aid offices?
Yeah, great question. The financial aid department and office really should be viewed and considered as important as the admissions office in this process. And similar to, excuse me, how admissions offices organize their staff and assign them to families, financial aid offices do something very similar. Usually it's by Alpha or it's by the college. I think that what you'll find is that if you can build rapport and build a relationship with the financial aid professional that's responsible for you, and really help them understand, especially if you're coming out of COVID as an example, in a different financial dynamic, an articulated, well-established relationship with that financial aid person can be really, really helpful, not only in the financing side, but it's not uncommon where a financial aid professional will say to an admissions person like myself, and like, you know, I just had a half-hour conversation with, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Jones. You know, they really, really want to make our IT work. You know, they're struggling a little bit financially. We're trying to work it out. But this is, I hear this all the time. You know, this is a family that we want in our IT. And usually that is stated because there's just a natural relationship that exists that it just feels like a good fit. And financial aid people are really, really culturally aware of wanting to help those individuals that they think just add value to the community. So they can be really helpful, really, really helpful. Great question.
Great, thank you so much. So just a couple quick, for our participants that are still with us, I wanted to let you know about a new alumni opportunity. Hopefully you've seen it. If you haven't, hopefully you will soon in social media and email, but we now have an alumni referral award scholarship that's available to incoming students for our next year. And we're putting the link to that referral form in the chat right now. So as an alum, you can nominate one student per year for this award, which will be $1,000 a year for four years. So potentially a $4,000 award. So can really make a difference for an incoming student. So if you have someone in mind, or if someone talks to you about RIT, it's a great way to start that conversation, and feel free to use that link to complete the referral form. The other thing I wanted to mention is we have a lot of volunteer opportunities in the Office of Admissions and ways that alumni can engage with prospective students that we would really love you to help us with. So we'll be following up today with some more of those opportunities. And if you're interested, we'd love for you to sign up for those. So I want to thank Ian so much today for sharing your expertise. I think everybody learned, and I think everyone learned a lot. And thanks for joining us at home. As we mentioned earlier, we'll send out information how to access this recording in the near future. Also, if you haven't yet, don't forget to make your Roar Day gift by using the link in the chat box. And then finally, if you're not already connected to the RIT Alumni Association's social media channels, we encourage you to do so. And those links can also be found in the chat box. So thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of Tiger Alumni Week.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.